Next up, an amazing piece of content, another one for you. We have a fabulous moderator leading a wonderful conversation. Marique Hazan, founding partner of Tabula Rasa, is going to lead a conversation with some powerhouses, and I am pumped for it. Join us, Marique. Panelists, join us up on stage.
So this panel that we have is short-term, medium-term, and long-term catalysts to the psychedelic industry. We're going to try to cover a whole breadth of topics, but before we do, let's introduce some of our other speakers. We have Doug Drisdale, Natalie Ginsberg, Daniel Carcillo, and Joel Stanley. Do you guys want to give a couple sentences on what you do within the psychedelic space, starting with Doug and going down?
Sure, happy to go first. Thanks for having us. So at Cybin, we're developing prescription therapeutics by developing novel derivatives and analogs of psilocybin and DMT for mental health disorders, primarily depression, addiction, and anxiety disorders. And the team has grown enormously over the last year or so. We're up to about 60 people now with a network of about 50 different partnerships. And we've been able to move our novel candidates from the bench essentially into the clinic in about 18 months. So we're just at this pivot point now where we're about to enter human studies this year, just within the next few months.
Beautiful.
Hi, I'm Natalie Ginsberg. I've worked at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, for almost 8 years. I'm currently the Global Impact Officer, but I also founded the policy team and worked as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for many years. And MAPS's mission is developing medical, legal, and cultural contexts for the safe and beneficial use of psychedelics, including cannabis. And our main focus is developing MDMA-assisted therapy to treat PTSD through the FDA process. And we're very close to FDA approval, so we're really excited about that.
Hi, everyone. Congrats, Natalie. Daniel Carcillo, CEO, founder of Wesana Health, a data-driven life science company focused on clinical development and also care delivery. We are taking our novel protocols through the FDA process. Recently communicated with the FDA in a pre-IND meeting, which was some really positive feedback, and focused on opening up an IND here in Q4 of this year.
I'm Joel Stanley. I was one of the founders and first CEO of the Charlotte's Web CBD company. I spent the last decade of my life in medical cannabis and hemp, and it was there that my family fell in love with botanical medicine. So our next chapter in life is called Ajna Biosciences. And we are a botanical drug development company focused first on psilocybin. Presently, we operate a almost 14,000 square foot laboratory in Denver, Colorado, DEA Schedule I licensed, and we're currently characterizing our first botanical psilocybin drug candidate to take into pre-IND meetings.
Now, what's interesting for folks who are kind of new to the psychedelics ecosystem, maybe coming from the world of cannabis, is just how complex and nuanced this ecosystem is, how many stakeholders it has. We're not just working with, drug development experts. We're working with individuals from policymaking, indigenous community members, researchers and scientists, therapists, doctors. And so it's super interesting to look at the drug development space, not just as a space that is focused on developing molecules, but one that is both tying those molecules to a therapy as well as tying them to so many different stakeholders. Could you all talk a little bit about who are the different stakeholders that in your day-to-day activities have really helped you reach those catalysts that you guys are and checkpoints that you guys need to be reaching to be able to take things forward that maybe are unexpected in traditional drug development?
Wants to go first?
Nobody wants to go first. Okay. I can say that it's been a bit of a process because we're dealing with Schedule I compounds, that every person, every organization that touches the compounds needs to be licensed. It's not particularly complicated to get a license, but it's another step that every piece of the supply chain has to go through, and it slows things down when you have when you're starting that from scratch. So we've been very focused on building this ecosystem that can help us from drug synthesis to analytical testing, to clinical testing. And we've done that both in the UK and in the US so that we can have supply chains on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, ultimately, we'll want to run clinical trials in multiple jurisdictions, and we don't want to be shipping back and forth, Schedule 1 products and all of the customs issues and timelines that adds to. So it's definitely adds a complication. It's not insurmountable, but it makes you think about every potential partner, every potential place you might do work or studies at, and the timelines you might take to get those licenses in place.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
I'd say MAPS are really most important stakeholders, especially for our drug development, are people suffering and surviving PTSD and really understanding how our work is impacting them and making sure they're really engaged in all aspects of the process. Another stakeholder that I think is often missing from a lot of these conversations, especially as more and more companies are emerging in the space as the stakeholders of indigenous communities who have been stewarding these medicines and practices. And I know it can be not come maybe as easily to conceive of how to engage stakeholders that may not be already a part of the work. But I think especially people who are working with medicines that come from specific communities have a responsibility to engage with those communities and have so much to learn from that. And so I just would love to bring those stakeholders into this space.
So to Natalie's point and to Doug's point, people, really focused on bringing something to light that can address a traumatic brain injury related symptom. As I mentioned before, there's no FDA approved pharmaceutical. Luckily, I experienced this medicine in a decriminalized city in a very indigenous specific way, if you will, using the natural substances. Ended up testifying in front of the DC Board of Elections to get Initiative 81 passed in Washington, DC to decriminalize psilocybin MDMA. But eventually, made a decision for my community and for the people that I'm close to, to go down a classic drug development pathway using a synthetic medicine that is within a 0.1% variance that the FDA accepts, and there's rules. But to Doug's point, the process is intricate. You have to make sure that you have your P's and Q's in order to stay on timeline, and just ensure that you are focused very poignantly and looking and planning 6 months ahead when you're dealing with Schedule 1 substances like psilocybin and unfortunately like CBD.
I would echo all of that with one slant, as our angle is really botanically focused. The majority of clinical science is around the single molecule or synthetic, but thousands of people today are using psilocybin mushrooms or some natural form of psychedelic, and thousands more will this weekend. So I think our stakeholders are, whether they're patients or physicians or researchers, that would like access on the medical side, not just in a recreational or gray market, but that would like access to the optionality of botanic versions of psychedelics. Those would really be the stakeholders that Ajna speaks to.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting about several of you is that the target demographics, the patient populations y'all have chosen to work with, whether it's Charlotte's Web before or MAPS work today, focuses on a pretty wide range of different types of patient demographics. For instance, veterans, athletes, children, as kind of telling the story of psychedelics. For investors who might be here or just individuals looking to get involved in the business of psychedelics, what are the specific patient populations that we can see being addressed through psychedelic-assisted therapy over the next 2 years? And also, what are the particular ailments that you guys are most curious to see whether psychedelic-assisted therapy can actually help heal?
I think coming from the world that I come from and witnessing the story of Charlotte Figge, Sanjay telling her story really changed the landscape for cannabis entirely. It opened so many doors. And I think that we as an entire industry need some of the stories like that. And it doesn't have to be pediatric. It doesn't have to be anything specific. Whatever's going to tug at our heartstrings so that popular opinion and then eventually regulatory opinion begins to truly change. So I think that we need stories like Charlotte's, and they can come up anywhere. You know, I think veteran populations make a lot of sense, but it's most likely going to be some refractory, not well treated type of indication in which, you know, hopefully we'll see some great success, either whether it's through one of the legalized states or through some of the clinical science moving to the FDA. Once we have those reports, hopefully we get some great media coverage around it, and that will elevate public perception, which will move the needle a ton, as we saw back the last decade with cannabis.
You know, I think I look at this through very much through a drug development lens. Obviously, there's, you know, we know that there are 900 million people around the world who are affected by some form of mental health disorder, eating disorder, addiction. So there are, you know, vast populations of people that can be treated. But in drug development, the patient population has to be really well defined. It's got to be a homogeneous group. There's got to be very well defined clinical endpoints that you think can match, you know, with the particular molecule, in order to be able to move anything through FDA. And of course, you know, we're a public company, so our investors want us to define markets that have a good ROI as well. It costs a lot to develop these treatments all the way through the FDA process. So having a really well-defined patient population, at least for the clinical studies, you know, is important, so that we can maximize the chance of success of getting through that. I think once you break down those first hurdles, then many other indications become possible, right? As revenues start to come in, you can start studying other patient groups, other populations that could benefit. Yeah.
I know you mentioned veterans, and a lot of MAPS stories involve, you know, really brave veterans willing to share their story. But actually, a majority of people in our studies were survivors of sexual assault. And I think it's just, those are stories that are often harder to be sharing and talking about. So, you know, that's definitely a population I hope we keep paying attention to. I know you mentioned substance use disorder, but I think there's a lot of really exciting potential there. And I also want to name that there's a few indications people are really afraid to explore, and I appreciate the intention and caution that's needed, but I would love to see studies exploring treatment with schizophrenia or bipolar or other kind of personality disorders that are not being explored, and there's really tremendous potential to help.
Yeah, I think, you know, communicating with the FDA about putting together, you know, 2 Schedule I's, albeit in a synthetic form, can sometimes be a little intimidating. So, you know, dipping a toe in and going after a smaller population like traumatic brain injury related major depressive disorder with 6 million people, to see what they would say and allow them to direct us, and really just, you know, get their feedback. And I think my whole organization was surprised by the fact that they're, you know, number one, pushing us into a broader indication that I think they're comfortable with. And there's very defined parameters around MDD, but also the orphan indications, to push us into a space that, you know, people are essentially catatonic, and their only line of defense from suffering is opiates. So that was eye-opening, but all of our correspondence has been extremely positive, and I think that's an exciting pathway forward for the whole industry.
I guess it reminds me that we had such promising phase 2 results that the FDA actually asked us to do pediatric studies, which I think is really interesting for like teenage right now. But so that's kind of a whole other space to explore, especially in the context of trauma, when we know so often early childhood trauma and experiences really impact addiction, PTSD, everything later. So really thinking of earlier intervention, but also exercising a lot of caution.
100%. Doug, you mentioned earlier kind of the, you know, tried and true understanding of drug development as being an extremely capital intensive process. I would love for you guys to tell us a little bit about the complex dynamics of raising capital for psychedelics, both in the private markets, the public markets, and through alternative financing vehicles, which many of y'all have participated in. So maybe we can get into a little bit of that discussion.
Sure. Okay, we can do that. Of course, the markets are not very friendly right now, to be honest. We're fortunate that when we decided to go public, we raised enough capital to get us through some major catalysts, and I think that's a mistake that a few companies made, that they didn't get enough funding at the outset. Typical biotech value creation tends to pivot right around phase 2. And that's when valuations start to shoot up really exponentially. So making sure we had enough capital to get through those major milestones for at least our first asset, and then of course continue to fund the other assets beyond that with a sort of risk diversified portfolio was important to us. But it's certainly been a difficult time for companies right now. I think we're going to see some consolidation. There's a good half a dozen psychedelics companies that are for sale right now or running on fumes. So I think the landscape will look quite different a year from now.
Mm-hmm. Is the decision looking back to begin going public at an earlier stage? Do you feel that that's something that, like looking back, is something you would change? Is it something that you think will continue and will benefit the industry? Just thoughts on that specifically.
No, I think you just have to be smart about when you raise money. So certainly enough capital at the beginning to get to a major value pivoting milestone, and then making sure there's enough cash on the balance sheet to ride through rocky markets, because you can't control the market, and you want to be able to raise capital when you want to raise capital, not when you need to raise capital. And I think some companies, unfortunately, are in a situation where they're desperate for cash and the markets are not particularly cooperating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Natalie, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the Vine financing, which is, I think a really incredible use of venture debt within the psychedelic space.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm pretty inspired by what we're building. MAPS has existed for 36 years, and we've been fueled philanthropically the entire time. And so when we started exploring raising capital, we wanted to develop something innovative that really allows us to protect our nonprofit ethos and approach. So we worked with Vine Ventures to develop an SPV that is a revenue share for our MDMA sales. What part that is really exciting to me is that we're retaining 100% of our equity for the $70 million raise. We're actually almost finished raising, which has been a really incredible experience. Yes, thanks. But it's a revenue share that's capped after 8 years, and there's 6.1% return. And we've created an interesting waterfall effect where once you get 3x your money back, it kind of reduces in half. So really the idea is getting a really solid return and also supporting nonprofit ethos and approach of MAPS.
And just a quick question, is this the first time that a nonprofit will have taken a compound all the way through the FDA approval process? Has that happened before?
It has happened before, but it's very rare. I know one case of that is called I'm forgetting the proper name, but it's known as the abortion pill, and that was developed by a nonprofit. But it's really difficult because, as many of you in this room know, it's incredibly expensive to take a drug to market. But there's really a lot of reasons that we feel it's so important to have this different structure. MAPS, I work at MAPS, the nonprofit, and we fully own the public benefit corp that conducts our research. And that allows us to prioritize public benefit and maximize patient outcomes before we're focused on maximizing profits solely. But of course, we have every intention of being sustainable and creating more funds that we then will reinvest back into the nonprofit and fund other research and education and policy reform. So that's really the structure that I'm really excited about and proud of, that we're kind of this hybrid nonprofit drug development entity that's also funding so much public education and drug policy reform and harm reduction.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I think one of the other questions that's been coming to me a lot from both investors and just other stakeholders in this space is, more access to psychedelics, whether that's through the decrim movement, recreational, whether that's through the ketamine clinic systems that are popping up. Do y'all think that more individuals having more access to these compounds are going to be the catalyst that we need, or is it too soon, too fast to be rolling out some of these new business models that are popping up within the psychedelics ecosystem?
Going from something like CBD to working with something like psilocybin, these are very, very different, right? And I like the approach that the industry's taking when we look at validation through clinical science. What we're doing is we're expanding access by going and getting physician advocacy. That didn't happen with cannabis. It was very, very different. And so when you have the clinical data and you have physician advocacy, that's going to broadly extend access to all of the people, through insurance, through payer systems, but to all of the people that might not look at psychedelics today as a viable option. When their doctor is advocating for it and going to help them with it, that's going to be the ultimate access. So I'm very, very happy to see the industry going through that pathway to expand access. It does take longer. I'm not a prohibitionist, of course, so I'm all for the state programs and I'm all for people accessing early, but too much of that to the wrong people and the amount of adverse events possible could be damaging to it. So I like the FDA approach. I like the clinical science approach. I think that it's the safest approach. It's not the fastest, but it's the safest for the broadest access worldwide.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. Rigorous science through a regulatory approval opens up, payer systems and opens up more access for people to be supported and experience these medicines in a responsible clinical manner. I really do believe in collecting data even after approval so that we can, do things like we're about to do with Wesana, which is make a presentation to a payer to get insurance remuneration for IV ketamine, which is not FDA approved. It's being used in an off-label form after the approval of Spravato, which is intranasal. So finding creative ways to open up avenues to help serve others, I think is important, and will only increase access and help serve the population of mental health, sufferers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as we get, sorry, Natalie, you want to go ahead? Okay. I think as we get past phase 2, is when I'm starting to get some safety data, then you'll also start to see companies using special access programs, compassionate use programs, early access programs that are available in a number of different jurisdictions, enabling you to get these treatments out to patients in need pre-approval. And a number of those programs exist in different parts of the world. And companies will need to use them as well as wanting to use them because FDA requires a safety database. We don't specifically know what it's going to be yet for each of these treatments, but for a chronic drug, FDA requires 1,500 patients in a safety database. No one's done a study with 1,500 patients yet in psychedelics. And because these aren't chronic treatments, it's not likely to be that big, the requirement. It's going to be something less, but still probably more than just the pivotal studies that are needed for approval. So to top up that database, to get approval, companies will likely access special access programs, compassionate use programs, early access programs to push up the numbers, safety numbers for approval. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to say I don't take it for granted that you say you're not a prohibitionist and that you're speaking about decriminalization, because I know there are many business interests, reasons to oppose decriminalization or drug reform. And we even saw in the cannabis space how cannabis companies would be opposing certain decriminalization or legalization efforts to protect their own interests. So that is something I really ask people to consider as they're moving forward, their short-term gains versus the longer-term opening up of a market and destigmatization and creating access for people who unfortunately might not be able to access these medications. MAPS is working really hard to get insurance coverage, but not everyone has insurance, and our treatment will be expensive because we have 2 therapists sitting with someone for multiple hours, and we don't want to have to reduce that, impact. So I just definitely really ask us to hold this in mind. And I know it can be a little scary sometimes when people are advocating for decrim without many regulations or much education. And where I believe it's really essential we just drop into education and harm reduction and making sure people understand what these medicines are about. And we are able to educate based on all this amazing clinical research. So there's really a beautiful connection there. And I see it all working in, synchronicity and synthesis. Yep. And that's where I'm grateful that MAPS is able to have this nonprofit approach, because we really see this whole bigger picture movement.
I think what's really important to note is that I was lucky enough to attend the phase 3 trial results of MAPS about a year and a half ago when they were just about to be released. And one of the things that was super interesting to find is if you even take the MDMA out of the equation, if you just do the therapy, you're still getting results that are more effective than your typical SSRI. Now, what this means is that we're not just innovating on drug development here, on the compound here, we're actually leading a really important movement in the advancement of therapeutics. And that advancement of therapeutics brings about all of these other pockets of industries. The picks and shovels is kind of the language that the cannabis industry has used. But here, that means the clinic systems, the DA-compliant facilities, the media companies, the retreat centers, all of these little pieces that are really helping to build this up. I'd love to talk a little bit about digital therapeutics, because that's something that many of the traditional drug development companies that I've gotten to interact with use on a day-to-day basis to really discover new compounds and be able to lead their companies forward. In the work that y'all are doing, are there specific tools that are helping you discover new compounds, specific technology that is being harnessed by your companies to be able to advance what y'all are building?
My answer would be on a little bit different. I mean, from the botanical side, this is the first time that we've been applying state-of-the-art equipment that is very new to over 185 different psilocybin strains, now go through the various cacti. The amount of opportunity to discover novel alkaloids is massive right now. And then there's also the various ratios of those compounds that have been given to us over millions of years of evolution. So from my side, botanical, my answer to that, is that it's laying there for us to partner with brand new technology, and the opportunity for discovery every day at the OSNA facilities is fantastic. But I am curious to hear that from more of the conventional drug development side.
So I talked a little bit about this earlier, but one study that we're undertaking right now is using neuroimaging, novel technology developed by Kernel, it's a company out on the West Coast, and it's essentially a miniaturized near-infrared spectroscopy. So just like your Apple Watch shines light into your wrist and you can see a little bit of hemodynamics, this uses, instead of wave light, pulsed light, quite powerful pulsed light, at 200 times a second across the whole cranium. And then the detectors measure the scatter that comes back. And the scatter can tell you whether you're looking at blood or brain or skull or whatever. You can determine. So what we're starting to see from a study is the ability to see changes in the brain during a psychedelic experience. So think about what we can do then with this very portable, miniaturized device that we can't do with an fMRI machine. You can't put hundreds of people through an fMRI machine. You can't measure people's brains every day, but with this device you can. And so to be able to set a baseline, see someone's brain activity before a psychedelic experience, see what's happening inside the brain during, and then after, what persists? And how long does it persist for? How many days or weeks after do those changes persist? And then can we correlate those changes with a particular molecule, with a particular dosing regimen, with a particular patient type, and maybe be able to use those tools earlier in drug discovery or development to say, okay, this molecule looks like it'll have an effect for 2 months. This one might be for 6 months. So really groundbreaking stuff and pretty interesting.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Interested in the development of digital therapeutics for kind of integration and prep. MAPS's model is really based on the therapy, as you bring up. It's even effective without the medicine. And I do believe I'm a social worker by training, so the therapeutic relationship is really healing. And, it's really expensive, and there's a lot of potential to combine, I believe, therapy with digital therapeutics. So I'm really interested in the forms that are kind of enhancing the therapeutic protocol and not necessarily replacing it. And to that end, I'm really excited about group therapy. And I think that there's a lot of ways that digital therapeutics might play an interesting role in that space too.
So yeah, from a drug development standpoint, picking a solid secondary endpoint to one day hopefully get to a point where we can convince the FDA that we can look at the actual indication of a concussion or traumatic brain injury is really important to me. So using the classic scales and then adding in something like a QEEG that has already been validated hundreds of thousands of times by the medical community is something that I'm really interested in and that we're looking at employing. And to your point, Natalie, telemedicine, 65% of our onboarding and the work that we do in our clinics is done through telemedicine, especially in this day and age. And when we speak to the numbers of hours of therapy that's associated with your program, I think that's going to come into play and be really impactful for supporting patients outside of the clinic.
Beautiful. We're running out of time. Just one sentence from each of you on where folks can follow you, how they can best support you going forward.
Cybin.com and CYBN on the NEO and the NEO Stock Exchange.
Maps.org or on Instagram at Maps News, on Facebook, Twitter. Follow us on social media and support us.
WesanaHealth.com on LinkedIn, website, Instagram. Personally, Daniel Carcillo 13 on Instagram and Daniel Carcillo everywhere else.
AjnaBiosciences.com. That's AJNA Biosciences, also on LinkedIn.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it.